Hey, history buffs, and welcome to the channel. Forget the quaint picture of a few angry colonists throwing tea bags. We are diving into the definitive moment that launched the American Revolt. This was not a protest about high prices. It was a calculated, high-stakes act of treason that stemmed from a staggering corporate bailout. The video you're watching is called The Epoch of the Ejected Cargo, because that's exactly what it was. December 16, 1773. A fortune in tea is destroyed. But here's the history secret the textbooks always gloss over. That East India Company tea? It was literally the cheapest tea available in the colonies. Why would the patriots risk hanging to destroy a discount product? Because accepting that cheap tea meant accepting eternal slavery. They saw the price tag not as a bargain, but as a silent, lethal concession to Parliament's absolute power. This wasn't about saving a few pennies. It was about saving their soul. Tonight, we reveal the truth behind the smoke and water. The massive EIC financial crisis that forced Britain's hand. The stubborn, greedy governor who trapped the colonists in a constitutional chokehold. And the moment Samuel Adams dropped the mic and authorized the final destructive answer. Hit that like button, subscribe for the deepest history analysis on YouTube, and let's find out how the cheapest tea in the world made the American Revolution inevitable. The epoch of the ejected cargo. How a corporate bailout fueled the American Revolt. The constitutional friction. A decade of sovereignty disputes. The dramatic midnight raid in Boston Harbor on December 16, 1773, was not an isolated outburst. It was the inevitable explosion following a decade of constitutional friction between the Anglo-American colonies and the Parliament in Westminster. The core dispute was not financial, but philosophical. The principle of no taxation without representation. While colonial assemblies conceded Parliament's right to oversee and regulate the vast web of imperial trade, they fiercely rejected its prerogative to levy internal revenue taxes, as they lacked any representation in the body dictating their fiscal obligations. By the early 1770s, after years of boycotts and protests, the British government had retreated, repealing most of the contentious Townshend duties. Yet, a single toxic symbol remained: the 3p tax per pound of imported tea. To the ministers in London, this meager duty was a non-negotiable anchor, a token intended to perpetually affirm the Crown's supreme legislative power over the entire empire. To the American patriots, especially the influential radicals in Boston, this 3p shackle was a persistent, stinging insult. A daily reminder that they were subjects without recourse, ruled by a distant assembly. The lawyer and future statesman John Adams immediately recognized the profound significance of the event the morning after the tea was spoiled. He wrote with striking prescience, noting the dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in the act. Adams understood that the people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. He labeled this audacious destruction of property as an epocha in history. This context frames the central paradox of the episode, an attack aimed at destroying a product that was by all accounts startlingly cheap. Why would a community risking treason choose to obliterate a commodity if the cost was not the primary issue? 2. The Poisoned Cup, EIC's Collapse and the Monopoly Gambit. To properly gauge the revolutionary temperature in 1773, one must first look 3,000 miles east to the halls of power and profit, the crumbling East India Company, EIC. This powerful yet deeply corrupt corporate entity, which effectively governed vast swathes of India, faced total insolvency by 1772. The EIC was quite literally too big to fail. Its collapse threatened to destabilize the entire imperial economy, forcing the intervention of Prime Minister Lord North's administration. In response, Parliament executed a corporate rescue plan, granting the EIC a large state loan in exchange for heightened governmental oversight. The EIC also needed to liquidate its massive surplus, estimated at 17 million pounds of unsold tea stockpiled in its warehouses. To facilitate this, the Tea Act of May 1773 was devised. This legislation did two critical things. It granted the EIC a direct shipping monopoly to the colonies, cutting out British middlemen, and it allowed the tea to be imported more cheaply than ever before, often undercutting the price of Dutch smuggled tea. The true cost of savings. The prevailing historical myth is that the colonists revolted because the tea was too expensive. The truth is far more nuanced and political. The patriots were not concerned with the immediate economy of the purchase. They were terrified by the long-term constitutional implications of accepting the poisoned discount. Accepting the EIC's cheap tea meant surrendering on three ideological fronts. Firstly, it implicitly ratified Parliament's right to maintain the symbolic 3p duty, thus legitimizing the very principle of taxation without colonial consent. Secondly, it sanctioned monopolies granted by Parliament, which threatened to crush independent American merchants, including major smugglers like John Hancock. John Adams starkly summarized the stakes. Allowing the tea to land would be giving up the principle of taxation by parliamentary authority and subjecting ourselves and our posterity forever to Egyptian taskmasters, to burthens, indignities, to poverty and servitude. In the eyes of the Sons of Liberty, the destruction of the tea was the only remaining absolute rejection of legislative tyranny. Third, the governor's veto, an ultimatum in the port. As the EIC ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, began arriving in Boston Harbor in late November 1773, the stage was set for a confrontation. While revolutionary leaders in other colonial ports like New York and Philadelphia successfully pressured or intimidated the EIC agents and ship captains into turning back, Boston became the epicenter of the crisis due to the rigid stance of its governor, Thomas Hutchinson. The inflexibility of power. Governor Hutchinson was a staunch loyalist with a vested interest in the outcome, as two of his own sons were among the appointed consignees for the incoming tea. When Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and thousands of townspeople gathered at Faneuil Hall and later the Old South Meeting House, they demanded that the ships be allowed to return to London without paying the duty. Hutchinson refused. He utilized his executive authority to prevent the ships from sailing until the mandatory 20-day customs deadline had passed, compelling payment of the tax. Hutchinson had essentially cornered the colonists. The choice was no longer between accepting or rejecting the tax, but between landing the tea and, thus conceding the principle, or destroying it. The backlash of the letters. Hutchinson's personal authority had already been fatally wounded earlier that year. The publication of his private letters, leaked by Benjamin Franklin, revealed that the governor had actively advised London to abridge colonial rights and deploy harsher military control. The revelation of this treachery cemented his status as a villain in the colonial mind, convincing patriots that he was a willing agent of their enslavement. When the crowd received his final negative response on December 16th, Samuel Adams delivered the final chilling verdict that authorized the dramatic shift from negotiation to violence. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. 4. The disguise of defiance, calculated chaos. The transition from political meeting to organized revolt was swift and surgical. A disciplined cohort of between 100 and 200 members of the Sons of Liberty streamed from the meeting house toward Griffin's Wharf. They were masked, some crudely, others with greater detail, as Mohawk or Narragansett Indians. The operation was conducted with military precision and astonishing restraint. Over 3 hours, the activists boarded the 3 vessels, using axes to systematically smash open 340 chests of EIC tea, a mix of Bohea black tea and green tea from China, and heave the contents into the freezing harbor. The value of the ruined cargo exceeded $1.7 million in modern currency. Crucially, only the tea was destroyed. No one was harmed, and no other ship property was damaged. Participants avoided violence against the ship crews or the British soldiers observing nearby. As one participant, George Hughes, recounted afterward, they quietly retired to our several places of residence without having any conversation with each other. This was calculated, clean destruction intended for maximum political effect, not a riot. The symbolic mantle. The choice of disguise was far more than a simple cloak of anonymity, which many participants knew was imperfect. Draping themselves in the Indian dress was a profound symbolic declaration. It was a visual rejection of their British identity and an assertion of their connection to the American wilderness and the continent itself. By taking the mantle of the native, the colonists proclaimed that they were no longer subservient subjects of the crown, but self-identified Americans. This powerful visual act of cultural secession foreshadowed the political separation that would inevitably follow. The Crown's retaliation, the acts of isolation. News of the Brazen Act reached London by January 1774, provoking a reaction that rapidly escalated from disbelief to fury. Initially, King George III dismissed the event as the mischief of a few hotheads. However, as detailed reports from the EIC and Governor Hutchinson arrived, the full scale of the attack upon property became undeniable. Parliament viewed the Tea Party not as legitimate protest, but as an act of treason and a direct assault on the fundamental legislative authority of the empire. The response was swift and merciless, the passage of a series of punitive measures known in Britain as the Coercive Acts, but forever branded by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. These laws were designed with one explicit goal: to isolate, punish, and crush the rebellious spirit of Boston and Massachusetts into submission. The key punitive acts included the Boston Port Act, March 1774. This act instantly closed the port of Boston to all shipping until the colony compensated the EIC for the destroyed tea. The intent was economic strangulation. The Massachusetts Government Act. This law effectively dissolved the elected local government of Massachusetts, placing executive power solely in the hands of the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act. Dubbed the Murder Act by colonists, it allowed British officials accused of capital crimes committed while enforcing the acts to be tried in Britain, thus circumventing colonial juries. The Quartering Act. This measure required colonial authorities to provide barracks for British troops in unoccupied private buildings. The paradox of impunity and unity. Despite the severity of the crime, classified as high treason by the Attorney General, and the omnipresent British military presence in Boston, the authorities were stunningly ineffective in bringing the culprits to justice. Of the hundreds of men involved, only one participant, Francis Akeley, was ever arrested and briefly imprisoned. This failure highlights the profound extent of colonial solidarity and the total collapse of the Crown's ability to govern through its own courts in Massachusetts. The participants kept their secret for decades, demonstrating a deep shared commitment to their cause. Furthermore, the intended isolation of Boston failed spectacularly. The other colonies interpreted the Coercive Acts not as specific punishment for Massachusetts, but as a blueprint for the subjugation of all colonial governments. 6. Epilogue. The inevitable spark. The retaliatory Intolerable Acts ultimately served as the ultimate catalyst for continental union. Colonies, including Virginia, whose assembly was dissolved by its governor for offering support to Boston, rallied behind Massachusetts, declaring days of fasting and sending vital aid to the closed port. Other tea parties occurred from New York to South Carolina, signaling widespread, unified resistance. The collective response to the imperial aggression was the formation of the First Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall in September 1774. This body, acting as the first unified government, organized a widespread economic boycott, the Continental Association, intended to force the repeal of the intolerable acts. The destruction of the tea thus created an irreversible, escalating sequence of events. Less than 18 months after the tea was dumped, the escalation culminated in April 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. When the 13 United States declared their independence in 1776, they specifically cited the punitive nature of the intolerable acts, the Crown's direct response to the Tea Party, as a key justification for their break, charging the monarch with offenses like obstructing the administration of justice and imposing taxes on them without their consent. The Boston Tea Party was, therefore, not a random, destructive act, but a meticulously planned constitutional declaration. Born of a corporate crisis and fueled by a governor's obstinacy, it was the moment the colonists shed their British identity for an American one, making the subsequent armed struggle not a choice, but an inevitability. But for now, please like, subscribe, and write an opinion about this story of the appearance of the phone.